Marhaba, bonjour, hello everyone. Welcome to the speaker series talk organized by the Plurilingual Lab and sponsored by the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance. أنا اسمي لانا زعيتر وأنا طالبة دكتوراه بجامعة ماجل وبحب رحب فيكم اليوم. My name is Lana Zaiter. I'm a PhD candidate in Educational Studies at McGill University, and I'll be your host for today's event. Today, we are honored to have Professor Stephen May from the University of Auckland, who will be presenting on linguistic racism, origins, developments, and implications. Before I give the floor to Professor Angelica Galante to give a few words about Professor May, I would like to start with the land acknowledgement. Next slide, please, Hannah. We join you today from McGill University, which is situated in Montreal, the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. Montreal has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among many First Nations. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters from which we join you today. We also invite each of you to reflect on and acknowledge the Indigenous lands in your own context. Now I pass it on to Professor Angelica Galante, the founder and director of the Plurilingual Lab, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Lana. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Dr. Stephen May, for accepting our invitation. We are very excited to have you. So if you don't know Professor May, he's a professor in Te Puna Wānanga School of Māori and Indigenous Education at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. He's actually on a Friday morning joining us from New Zealand. He is an international authority on language rights, language policy, bilingual education, the multilingual turn in language teaching, and critical multicultural approaches to education. Dr. Stephen May has published over 100 articles and book chapters in these areas, along with 27 books, including the award-winning Language and Minority Rights in 2012, and the Multilingual Turn in 2014. His most recent book is called Critical Ethnography, Language, Race, Racism, and Education, published in 2023. Dr. Stephen May is also editor-in-chief of the 10-volume Encyclopedia of Language Education in its third edition from 2017, and founding co-editor of the journal Ethnicities. He's also an AERA Fellow and Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. So we are very excited to have him here, and I hope you all have a wonderful talk and sitting here listening to this wonderful presentation. Before calling Dr. Stephen May to present, I'll pass it on to Lana once again, who will provide some Zoom etiquette.
Thank you, Dr. Galante. So before we dive into today's talk, let's just quickly go over some Zoom etiquette to ensure that our virtual gathering runs smoothly and that everyone has a positive experience. So during the talk, we ask you please to keep your video and sound off. You can use the thumbs up and hands clapping feature to react to Dr. May's presentation and talk. The talk will be recorded and available in the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel. So we encourage you to keep an eye on our social media account because usually we announce it on social media when the talk is available. After the talk, there will be about 30-minute Q&A, so discussion period. During that time, you can post your questions in the chat box, or you can unmute your microphone and ask the question. The discussion will be moderated by our colleague Hannah Kame, and it will not be recorded. So only the talk by Dr. May will be recorded. Professor May, the floor is yours.
Kia ora koutou katoa ka nui te mihi kia koutou. Ahi hahi Māori, bon après-midi. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's, as Angelica said, Friday morning here, the day after. But thank you for coming, and thank you for being here today. It's a pleasure and a privilege to speak with you today on this issue. I thought I would start with some acknowledgements, just very briefly. I'd like to acknowledge the tangata whenua of Montreal, Kania Kiahaka, and nation of the Kawanote Tiontiakon area, which is now known as Montreal. Greetings from Aotearoa. I'd like to thank the plurilingual staff, Angelica, Liana, Hannah and Kiana, for hosting this and for this very important series, which has drawn a wonderful range of speakers over time. And it's, as I said, a pleasure and a privilege to be able to join them today. I'd like to just briefly acknowledge my early academic mentors, particularly Professor Timothy Karutu, the preeminent Māori language scholar in Aotearoa, New Zealand, around Māori language revitalisation. And my first advisor, the late David Corson, who was before his death at Oise in University of Toronto. And they were very influential in terms of establishing the work that I've subsequently gone on to do. I'd also like to acknowledge the numerous colleagues with whom I've collaborated closely on a wide range of projects over the years, both in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and internationally. And so I'm just having some issues with my PowerPoint. Oh, there we are. And my current colleagues and friends in my school, Te Puna Wānanga, the School of Māori and Indigenous Education at the University of Auckland, Waipapa Taumata Row, and especially to Myong Park, Peter Keegan and Lincoln Dam, with whom I'm currently working on a range of related projects exploring linguistic racism and discrimination, particularly in higher education. I won't be speaking to that directly today. I'll be rather talking about some more general issues in relation to linguistic racism, but I just wanted to acknowledge those connections. And if you're interested, you can follow those at the Linguistic sitecom that we've established recently. So a bit of a delay in my PowerPoint, but we'll see how we go. I'd also like, just before I get underway, to give you a little bit of background in terms of my own positionality. I'm what we call here in Aotearoa Pākehā, a white New Zealander, and I grew up in Christchurch. Its Māori name is Ōtautahi. And what's interesting about it is it was a resolutely monolingual and monocultural upbringing. As I note here, overtly imbued, situated, saturated in the colonial context of Aotearoa, New Zealand as a British settler society. Christchurch, for a very long time, and perhaps still even now, liked to think of itself as a little bit of Britain in the South Pacific. And so that was very much the context in which I grew up. And as a result of that, in fact, it was that led me away from that kind of monoculturalism and monolingualism to garner an interest in diversity and to address also the silences of colonialism in my own context growing up. And it was as a result of that that I learnt te reo Māori as an adult, firstly as a secondary school teacher and subsequently as an academic in universities. And that's what I bring to this particular discussion, my bilingualism in English and te reo Māori. I also teach in te reo Māori at the University of Auckland and have experience as an adult language learner, as I know many others of you have had as well. In terms of my academic focus, as Angelica briefly mentioned, I've been exploring really over the course of my academic career the limits of monocultural and monolingual precepts that underpin so many language policies and practices even today, and including language education approaches. And that's my broad interest. I've undertaken this from 5 key perspectives: from my work on language rights, critical multiculturalism, Indigenous language and other forms of bilingual education in close collaboration with my colleagues in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the multilingual turn in language education, and most recently this work that we've been exploring collectively with my colleagues, but also in terms of my own work around linguistic racism. And it's that I wish to speak with you today about. Briefly, my interdisciplinary background is in English, applied linguistics, sociolinguistics at undergraduate level, master's in education and a PhD in sociology. And in terms of my work, I've also engaged in some detail in issues of political theory and human rights law. So I bring that to this discussion. And I also bring to this discussion my grounding in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also my examination of these issues internationally in a wide range of contexts. And I'll draw on those briefly in what follows in terms of what I go on to speak about. I've taught in 3 New Zealand universities, Massey University, Waikato, and for the last 12 years at the University of Auckland, of Waipapa Taumatarau. And I spent a decade, at the University of Bristol in the UK. And if you want to find out more about my own background, that's just a very brief overview of what I bring to this discussion, but I just thought I would mention those before proceeding into this talk. So I want to begin by just referring to a recent special issue that we put out, because a lot of the work that I'll talk about today relates directly to this. As a result of working at the University of Bristol for a decade, we at that time began the journal Ethnicities with my colleague Tariq Maudud and I, editing it since that time. And just last year, I put together a special issue for the journal focused specifically on linguistic racism, language racism and inequality. And I'll draw on some of that work directly today, particularly my own introduction and in terms of the case study that I'll talk about, which is my own context here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, looking at the current resurgence of racism, linguistic racism towards Te Reo Māori. But there are other key contributors in that volume as well. Shaina Sultana, who looks at Bangladesh, Ingrid Piller and her colleagues who were looking at media representations of whiteness in Australia. Anna Tankasic and Senda Dovchin, of course, writing around linguistic racism in the workplace. Ryuku Kubota and her colleagues looking at racism in higher education in the Canadian context, and Suresh Kanagaraja looking particularly at the work of Geneva Smitherman. So I just thought I'd mention that to you because, as I say, I'll be drawing directly on some of those on my own contributions to this special issue, but there may be other contributions therein that might be of interest to you. In terms of what I'm going to talk about today then, this is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to begin by exploring a number of interdisciplinary threads and conceptions of language and racism over time. And then I'm going to focus specifically on key threads in linguistic racism and the literature on linguistic racism, drawing on language ideologies and raciolinguistics in particular. And then in the final part of my presentation, I'll look at the case study, as I said, of my own context, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and particularly the increasingly vocal opposition to Te Reo Māori and more broadly Māori language revitalisation. And I'll come back to that, as I say, at the end. So let me begin in terms of this overview of linguistic racism. And I begin from various different disciplinary perspectives, because in not wanting in any way to diminish the importance of raciolinguistics, which I'll go on to discuss, and its key influence in this work, I want to broaden it out because some of this interdisciplinary, some of the interdisciplinary aspects, some of the interdisciplinary origins sometimes get lost in the discussion. And so here I'm drawing on key work in the sociology of nationalism, particularly Benedict Anderson, and his notion of imagined communities, Bauman and Briggs, Voices of Modernity, 2003, Ernest Gellner, a key commentator on nationalism, Ralph Grillo, my own work in language and minority rights there, and of course Walter Mignolo and his work on colonialism in the Americas. And what's interesting about this work in relation to linguistic racism is that it's linked intrinsically, although not always explicitly, to processes of racialization, but also internal and external colonization, and more broadly, modern nation building, which is predicated on the notion of nation-state congruence. And nation-state congruence, very briefly, is the idea that the boundaries of political and national identity should coincide. This is the underlying precept of modern nationalism. It really only emerged out of the European nationalism of the middle of last millennium. So it's quite a recent historical phenomenon. Prior to nationalism, of course, feudal societies, and particularly empires, were not preoccupied with that position and were much more, as a result, linguistically diverse in terms of the way that they addressed language. But because of nationalism's preoccupation with establishing a national polity and, by extension, national language, both in somewhat political, socio-political and socio-historical constructions, nationalism has been underpinned by this notion of linguistic homogeneity via national and invariably, in at least the first instance, European languages. And in the sociology of nationalism, these national languages which were chosen, they were deliberately selected, were also perceived specifically as unifying, as a basis for social cohesion, and as modern, so linked to the Enlightenment and to notions of modernity. And in contradistinction, other local languages, and particularly indigenous languages, were constructed as antediluvian, as primitive, as limiting. And these, what Anthony Liddicoat usefully calls these linguistic hierarchies of prestige, underpin the sociology of nationalism and the idea of modern nation states. And it is therefore also predicated on what Ralph Gritto talks about as the ideology of contempt towards other languages. As I've mentioned, this is a recent historical development. Feudal societies and empires were not concerned with linguistic homogeneity in the way that the modern nation-state system is. So although we see it now as normalized and take it for granted, really it's only been in the last few hundred years that we've had this preoccupation. And just finally, in the work that I've done around language rights, I talk about this in my book, Language and Minority Rights. This was achieved, as I said, deliberately and via generally two aligned processes. Legitimation, which in many cases was around making the national language official, although not all contexts follow that, including my own and including the US and the UK. But also, and probably the key element, institutionalization, particularly via education. So education has played a key role in establishing and dispersing the national language across its constituent populations. And if we think particularly again of Indigenous peoples, then we can see that in the effects of residential schooling in Australia and of course in the Canadian context, which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission highlighted, and tragically also more recently some of the wider perhaps genocidal effects of that. These are often a corollary to this kind of nation building in terms of the way that Indigenous languages and other local languages are treated. I'll come back to that in relation to the New Zealand context. The other aspect of this, the aligned aspect of this, is that really because of this phenomenon of nationalism and the nation state, modern nation state formation, the last few centuries have been predicated on this notion of monolingualism, and I refer you here to a very influential book by David Gramling in 2016, The Invention of Monolingualism, where he observes whether we opt to call it a myth, a pathology, a paradigm, a relic, or a sham, monolingualism is woven into modernity's most minute and sophisticated political structures. And that's entirely true if we think of the history of, for example, language policy in terms of at least its academic and practical origins from broadly the 1950s, 1960s onwards. And particularly in the early days, we saw early language policy in post-colonial contexts basically replicating the nation-state model, privileging ex-colonial languages as lingua franca and establishing them often as national languages, even in post-colonial contexts. Sedimenting diglossia so that local and Indigenous languages, if they were used at all or maintained, were only in the private domain, low status family community domains, and the same broad treatment of Indigenous and local languages. So language policy in its origins has reflected this notion of nation-state congruence and, as I said, Liddicoat's idea of linguistic hierarchies of prestige. And now, of course, we're seeing similar linguistic hierarchies of prestige in relation to the ascendancy of English as the current international language, along with the expansion of English medium instruction worldwide. So these same hierarchies are now being extrapolated into the international domain and international languages vis-a-vis national languages. But the same principles, the same underlying precepts apply. And then just a brief segue, because we did mention the multilingual turn. One of the interesting things about this preoccupation with linguistic homogeneity is it's really the touchstone, the foundation of much of the structural linguistics that was undertaken in the 20th century, and particularly through the notion of de Saussure's distinction between langue and parole. And as a result of that, with a focus on langue, on the system rather than on speech, many of the monolingual precepts that underpin language teaching and learning, second language acquisition, which I know that Lourdes Ortega talked about recently in this series. That's the reason why they remain at the core of much structural linguistics, including SLA, despite the so-called multilingual turn. And I refer you here briefly to Bourdieu, who observes of this, that to speak of the language without further specification, as linguists do, is tacitly to accept the official definition of the official language of a political unit. So basically this notion of nation-state congruence, and that's bound up with the state and its social uses. And this state language, the national language or the international language in the case of English, becomes the theoretical norm which all linguistic practices, by which all linguistic practices are objectively measured. And he then goes on to talk about this victorious language, in effect, is simply taken for granted by linguists, both as the normative basis for analysis and the benchmark for teaching and learning. And so the monolingual precepts of language acquisition versus use, notions like native speaker or native-like competence, error analysis, and so on, which still underpin much of the language teaching and learning terminology, can also be linked back, I argue, to nation-state congruence and its sedimentation in structural linguistics in the 20th century. But as I said, that's a little segue. So let me turn to the second origin of linguistic racism, which of course is the very important work on colour racism. And I'll focus particularly on the late 20th century and critical race theory in particular, although of course much of this work is indebted to key commentators like Du Bois and Fanon, whose early work in the early 20th century has been hugely influential in this regard. But colour racism initially focused on the biological determinants of racism, the black-white binary, particularly shaped by the US and North American experience. And this underpinned much of the early work of critical race theory. I have here a book, just a photo of Paul Gilroy, the British sociologist's book Against Race, a very important commentary on this. And it was really only from the early 2000s onwards that CRT subsequently shifted to a more expansive understanding of race, so moving away from the black-white binary to incorporate at least potentially other aspects, broader cultural and linguistic dimensions. And we've seen that development over the last 20 years, particularly in a much more active intersectional engagement of CRT with other key aligned frameworks such as Lat Crit, Asian Crit, Tribal Crit in terms of Indigenous peoples, Queer Crit and Black Crit. I refer you to a very good volume in relation to critical race theory in teacher education by Han and Laughter that refers to that. So that's the second strand. And then I want to bring attention to the third strand, because this is the one that I think is most often overlooked. And this is around the notion of new racisms. And this work was undertaken particularly in the British context in the 1980s and the 1990s, and was subsequently picked up by other European commentators. But the term was first used by the British commentator Martin Barker in his book, New Racisms. And then it was picked up, as I said, by European commentators such as Etienne Balibar, who talked about it as a spectrum of racisms. And really this work focused on the fact that racism could be expressed in other ways, not just in terms of the colour line and Du Bois's terminology, but also in terms of religion particularly, and for our purposes here, language, without necessarily mentioning colour at all. And Teun van Dijk's work is also interesting here, which I'll come back to shortly. And this work was again picked up in the US, although interestingly there was a disjunction between the initial work and subsequent work and the American work, particularly Eduardo Bonilla Silva's influential work on new racisms talks about this as well, although without reference to the earlier work in Britain and the US, but nonetheless a sort of comparable approach looking at the expression of racism via other means, including language, and in terms of Bonilla Silva's work, of course, looking particularly at Latinx, Latin identities. So that's the third key strand that informs work on linguistic racism. And the fourth is from social psychology. So from around about the 1990s onwards, and particularly initially the work of Essed in terms of the notion of everyday racism, how was everyday racism discursively constructed in conversation particularly, but in social interactions more generally. And I refer here in particular to one of the very early works on this by Margaret Wetherell and Jonathan Potter, which again I'll come back to because it actually explores the New Zealand context specifically. But they argue in their book, Mapping the Language of Racism, that racism is organised through discursive patterns of signification and representation, and thus must be investigated through the specific analysis of discourse. Having said that, they go on to state that we're not wanting to argue that racism is a simple matter of linguistic practice. Investigations of racism must also focus on institutional practices, on discriminatory actions, and on social structures and social divisions. But the study of these things is nonetheless intertwined with the study of discourse. So this social psychology, emphasis on everyday racism, and particularly in Wetherell and Potter's early work, focused specifically on linguistic racism, is another important strand. And that was also, as I mentioned earlier, picked up by the influential European scholar Teun van Dijk and his influential book, Elite Discourse and Racism, looking at media representations in the early 90s in relation to racist constructions. So that brings me to linguistic racisms. And as I said, I've been exploring this directly for a number of years. This is the recent book to which Angelica referred, that while its focuses on other things, or among other things is on critical ethnography, also looks directly at issues of language, race and racism in education. But let me just briefly summarize where we are here. So linguistic racism, at least as I understand it, stems from the languages, or the language, the dialects that one uses, the ways such language is spoken. This is from Ingrid Piller's important work. So linguistic racism is a form of linguistic discrimination. It represents, I argue, a new racism, one which is primarily based on one's language background, communicative repertoires, and language practices. And it simultaneously discriminates against minorities on the basis of their ethno-racial and socio-cultural backgrounds. So this is what I argue. This is also a key tenet of Centre Dovchin's work in relation to linguistic racism as well. But I draw on Paul Crosscritty's pivotal work in this regard, and I'll come back to his work shortly. But his definition, I think, is a very succinct one. Linguistic racism thus constitutes racist and racializing acts and or projects that use linguistic resources as a means of discrimination and subordination. So let's look at the two key strands, at least the two key strands that I wish to explore today in relation to linguistic racism before I turn, as I said, to the example of Aotearoa New Zealand. So the first key strand is obviously work done in language ideology or language ideologies and related linguistically racialized hierarchies. And as mentioned, Paul Crosscritty's work is very influential here. Jane Hill, in her book, The Everyday Language of White Racism, excuse me, is also an influential part of this. How is this comprised? Well, it's comprised by this notion of personalism. This is particularly evident in Hill's work, but also in Crosscritty's work, really around the fact that denying racist intent or consequence in the use of language, which Irvin and Gale call ideological closure, doesn't obviate the fact that discourses that may be used are still racist. So while people can deny racist intent in the use of discourses, that doesn't obviate the fact that they are nonetheless still racist. And this is picked up particularly in Jane Hill's work around the distinction between covert and overt racism. So distinguishing between overt and covert forms of linguistic racism. And she, in one of the examples that she discusses in her book, is of course mock Spanish. And again, this idea that even though people might say, well, I was only joking in the use of mock Spanish, nonetheless, it's still a linguistically racist discourse. And then Paul Crosscritty, who summarizes his decades-long work in this area in the recent Oxford Handbook of Language and Race, has these four key tenets, which he highlights. Positionality, so basically the perception that language use is often constructed to and for the specific advantage of those who are in linguistically dominant positions. So this helps us to understand why linguistic racism is directed almost always towards minorities. He highlights also the notion of multiplicity, the intersectionality of the use of language with other social identities, such as gender, class, or whatever it may be, sexuality. The third component of awareness, that these things can exist even when speakers are not necessarily aware or only have a degree of awareness that linguistically racialized discourses are being used or employed. And then particularly drawing also on Jane Hill's previous work, the notion of referentialism. One of the early preoccupations with racist discourse was on sort of obvious forms of racism, such as racial epithets, slurs, and the propositional content of language, the vocabulary that's used. And while that's still an important component, one of the key aspects that language ideology work brings and expands in relation to linguistic racism is the focus on discursive practices. So a broader examination of the role and influence of social indexicality in the construction of racist discourses. And I'll come back to that. It aligns too, of course, with the work in social psychology, among others, in terms of that focus on the racialization of discourses. So that's one key strand. And then, of course, we come to what many of us are perhaps most familiar with, and certainly a lot of the most recent and important work in this area comes under the umbrella of Raciolinguistics, H. Samuel Lim, Jonathan Rosa, Nelson Flores, Ryuku Kubota, Django Paris, Ingrid Piller, among others, who've written into this influentially. And what we see here is this notion of language being used as a proxy for race. So Alim talks about it as racing language or languaging race. And Jonathan Rosa, in his important book, talks about looking like a language, sounding like a race. So focusing on language use as an indexical marker of race and racism. Now, what's interesting about Raciolinguistics is its initial early focus was on the construction of linguistic and racialized others. So in effect, looking at the impact of racialization, linguistic racism on the construction of minoritized, discriminated others. But more recently, there's been more of a focus on the hegemonic linguistic and racial identities. So coming back to that notion of positionality in Crosscutty's work and the related entrenchment, reinforcement of linguistic privilege, particularly in post-colonial settler contexts. And that's where I think this work is really significant in terms of exploring that dialectic, and I'll explore it directly in the case study that I finished with today. So just to summarize, excuse me, drawing on two key quotes from Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores' work, again in the Oxford Handbook of Language and Race, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend. Very accessible but very rich theoretically and conceptually rich discussion. But in that they talk about the fact that although ratiolinguistic ideologies differ in some ways across conventionally defined colonial and post-colonial contexts, these various settings are characterized by the ideological assumption that racialized subjects' language practices are somehow unfit for legitimate participation in a modern world. So again, this correlates with the notion I mentioned earlier, Tony Liddicote's notion of linguistic hierarchies of prestige. And then just one other quote, which brings us to the case study. Ratiolinguistic ideologies that organized these colonial relations continue to shape the world order in the post-colonial era by framing individualized, racialized subjects' language practices as inadequate for complex thinking processes needed to navigate the global economy on the one hand, and as targets of anxiety about authenticity and purity on the other. Contemporary ratiolinguistic ideologies must be understood within this broader history of European colonialism, and I might add, as I did at the start, also European nationalism. So with that, let me turn just in the last 20 minutes to the case study of my own context, Aotearoa, New Zealand. As I said, I grew up in, you can't see the map very clearly, but in the lower island, the South Island, Te Waipounamu, Ōtautahi, Christchurch is just on the right-hand side in the middle. This is the context. I'll just give you a bit of brief background for those of you who may not be directly familiar with the New Zealand context. It's like many a British settler colonial society. Te reo Māori, and the Māori language was initially the lingua franca and language of trade and education in the early 19th century. However, processes of colonisation saw it banned from schooling from about the middle of the 19th century onward for well over a century. We have a pivotal treaty in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Treaty of Waitangi to Treaty of Waitangi, which was, or at least was meant to be, the foundation for a different colonial experience, but in the end was largely ignored, quite quickly ignored, as Pākehā white New Zealand settlers outnumbered and soon came to dominate New Zealand society from about the 1850s, 1860s onwards. And that resulted over time in Māori language shift and loss. As I said, Māori was excluded from schooling for much of the 19th and most of the 20th century, up until the middle of the 20th century. But Māori language shift and loss really only occurred extensively after the Second World War with rapid urbanisation, because it had been continued to be spoken in home, predominantly rural marae, meeting places where Māori lived. But with rapid urbanisation after the Second World War, we saw a precipitous decline in Māori language use. Then just a couple of recent developments which will help contextualise the discussion that I'll go on to have. We did have the establishment in 1975 of the Waitangi Tribunal, which basically, although it was a political accident, well, I can't go into that now, has been very influential in looking at issues of settlement in terms of land confiscation that occurred across the 19th century, particularly through into the 20th century, where much of Māori land was appropriated illegally via various means. And so since 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal has been an arbiter of that process in terms of negotiating settlements for the land that has been lost, but also addressing key issues like language. In a claim in 1986 that was brought to the Waitangi Tribunal, that claim was around specifically Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, and making sure that it continued to survive in a context where it might not otherwise. And that led to Te Reo Māori being an official language, or made an official language, in 1987. And more recently has seen the establishment, well, at least in the last 20 years, of Māori television for kata Māori. So we had a situation where Te Reo Māori was only spoken by Māori communities, even then at threat, and basically invisibilised over time by colonisation. But since particularly the 1980s onwards, and the rise of Māori medium education, of course, with which Aotearoa, New Zealand is probably most familiar to some of you in relation to Indigenous language revitalisation, a key driver of Indigenous Māori language revitalisation has occurred from the 1980s onwards via education, but also via these other means. So this brings us back, excuse me, to the notion of institutionalisation that I mentioned earlier. And so what we've seen in the last 20 years in Aotearoa is an increasing normalisation of Te Reo Māori and a growing number of public, crucially, language domains. And what we've also seen, and what I'll talk about in the remainder of the time that I have, we've seen a growing opposition to this normalisation, particularly from older monolingual Pākehā white New Zealanders. And just as a segue here, whenever a minoritised language in any context is given sort of formal recognition, but also institutional recognition in public domains, there tends to be opposition from the dominant, usually, not always, but certainly monolingual, often, group. And we saw this, of course, in the Canadian context, as you well know, with Bill 101. And we think of legal cases like Ballantyne, Davidson and McIntyre versus Canada in 1989, which was taken to the UN by Anglophone parents in Quebec, trying to argue against French immersion schooling. So this, while I'm talking about New Zealand here, this is a common process. We see it in Catalonia as well, of course, and the Basque country, and some of the wider pushback from other areas of Spain in relation to these areas of minority or Indigenous language revitalisation. So as I said, while I'll focus on Aotearoa here, this is a common phenomenon in terms of any kind of minoritised Indigenous language revitalisation. And then just very briefly, before I look at some specific examples, just again, for your own familiarity, just a very brief summary of Māori language policy over time. So what we saw, particularly from the 1980s onwards, and particularly through Māori medium education, an initial focus on Te Reo Māori as a taonga, as a treasure, guaranteed under the treaty. This was actually the case that was taken to the Waitangi Tribunal and led to Te Reo Māori becoming an official language. And so there was initial focus on re-establishing it for Māori by Māori, principally, and that has been, as I said, a key underpinning of early Indigenous language revitalisation focus and Māori medium education. But just in more recent years, there's been a shift in Māori language policy to normalising Te Reo Māori as widely as possible by also encouraging and including non-Māori learners and speakers as well. And the example of this is the most recent strategy for Māori language revitalisation, Mahi Korona, which has 3 key goals. By 2040, that 1 million New Zealanders or more, that's about a fifth of the population. New Zealand has about approximately 5,250,000 people at the moment currently. So around about 1 million, a fifth, will have the ability and confidence to talk about at least basic things in Te Reo Māori. The second key goal, that by that time at least 85% of New Zealanders will value Te Reo Māori as a key part of their national identity. And the third key goal, that 150,000 Māori aged 15 and overs will be able to use Te Reo Māori and English, in effect, to be bilingual. So that's the background. And let me turn now, in the time that I have remaining, 15 minutes or so, maybe a little less, just to some examples, some specific examples around linguistic racism and the pushback, as I mentioned earlier, towards this. And this, for those of you who don't know him, is Taika Waititi, the New Zealand director, Māori, known for Thor Ragnarok and various other films. And he had married to Rita Hall, for those who read the lifestyle magazines. But in an interview in 2018 with the British magazine Dazed, he, along with Ruben Nielsen, who is a musician, Unknown Mortal Orchestra, both Māori New Zealanders, both living at that time in the US, and so having an interview with Dazed magazine about growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also, of course, their own trajectories. And during that interview, at one point, the interviewer said, I think I've got quite an idealized version of New Zealand as like Australia with without the racism and the blokish sense of humor. And Taika Waititi famously or infamously, because of course a number of people didn't like this very much, said, nah, it's racist as. And that became quite a story at the time. It was picked up by the international media, but it was also at the time, particularly here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there was sort of outraged moral opprobrium that someone could dare suggest that New Zealand was still a racist country, because although I haven't mentioned it, there was a very strong discourse in relation to New Zealand's colonial history, at least up until the 1980s, until it was actively challenged by the Māori language renaissance and the wider Māori political movement towards tino rangatira, self-determination. There was this colonial myth that somehow New Zealand, had been a wonderful example of collaboration between Māori and European colonizers, Indigenous and European colonizers. And basically, Taika Waititi is calling this out. This is not the case. And he says specifically, of course, people just flat out refuse to pronounce Māori names properly. And I'll come back to that shortly. As I said, a lot of pushback at the time, but we'll see clearly that this is actually the case. So I have a number of examples here that I want to briefly explore before bringing this to a close. This, as I said, comes back to the work of Weatherall and Potter. Now, as I said, the social psychology of linguistic racism was really established in the early 1990s. And Weatherall and Potter, one of the very first to do this, in their book, Mapping the Language of Racism, looks specifically at the New Zealand context, but has these wider implications. Margaret Weatherall is a New Zealander. Jonathan Potter is a British academic. They were in Britain at the time, but they came back, I think, on sabbatical to undertake this study. And they draw on everyday racialized discourses of Māori, but they also address at points or look at particular views about Te Reo Māori, the Māori language. And this is just one example of someone being interviewed. That's why I actually object to things, to them bringing massive Māori culture curricula into schools. The bolding, by the way, is mine, to a certain extent, because I do feel that this doesn't equip them for the modern world at all. Because what's the use of being able to speak Māori if you can only speak it to a limited number of people in a limited area, and it has no use in the actual, in the real world? And then this interviewee goes on to say, I've got nothing against Māori people, of course, a classic racial motif. You know, my best friends are X, but I find the Māori language of no use, really. Now, it may be part of their heritage, but I'm not buying that because in, say, the year 2020 or whatever, we won't be worried about speaking the Māori language. We'll be worried about speaking, if anything, French, German, Japanese. Why? Because this interviewee goes on to say, because, well, they're trading languages, and that's why we need them. Now, there's a certain irony in this that I'll just briefly mention, is that like a lot of English language dominant contexts worldwide, language teaching is in significant decline, or certainly European language teaching is. And so just interestingly, at the moment, French is the sixth most studied language here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. German is 9th, and Japanese is 17th, sorry, as spoken language. So French 6th, German 9th, Japanese 17th. Māori is still second, Te Reo Māori, the second most language spoken, followed by Samoan in the New Zealand context, and then Northern Chinese. So a degree of irony, as I say, that in the early 1990s, this so-called projected dominance of other European languages has not emerged. Now, I'm only going to speak very briefly to this particular one because this is an example recently, 2017, within the last decade, a sort of bilious piece of racist drivel masquerading as an opinion piece in the newspaper by older white Pākehā David Witherow. As I said, I'm not going to speak about it too much, except as an exemplar of overt racism. So coming back to that distinction between overt and covert racism. And this is taken from another commentary on the piece, but it's just the blue that I'll talk to. This commentator talks about the fact that a couple of Māori snowflakes were banging on about the terrible grief they were suffering from the mispronunciation of their names. So just exactly illustrating Taika Waititi's point. And what we get here, of course, is a classic move, which we're seeing increasingly around the world, and particularly in North America, where anything that's deemed to be related to issues of equity or equality are somehow seen as woke, politically motivated, weak-kneed liberals. And this is the classic trope that's used here by this commentator. And then they go on to talk about Radio New Zealand, which is really the equivalent of NPR, for example, or the BBC. And this commentator says, well, you know, this is supposed to be free of political meddling, yet now it is being hijacked as its hapless staff are obliged to dispense their daily dose of te reo. There were just a few words to begin with, and then longer sentences, which have kept on growing. So basically in Aotearoa, New Zealand, over the last 10 years or so, we've seen our main radio broadcaster increasingly using Te Reo Māori in the news. And this is what this public outrage has been directed against. As I said, this article is sort of an overt form of racism, but let me pick up the same issue from a somewhat different perspective. This person, for those of you who don't know, is Don Brash, a former Conservative Party leader in Aotearoa, New Zealand, nearly became Prime Minister in 2004. Helen Clark's then Labour government only maintained its power by 1 or 2 seats at the time. And subsequently, he leads, having left Parliament, leads a group called Hobson's Pledge, which again, I'll come back to briefly. But he picked up this theme around the use of Te Reo Māori on the radio. And there's an infamous interview with another key journalist, Kim Hill, that's a KH in this case, who basically interviewed him as to why he was so outraged, he and his group, Hobson's Pledge, were so outraged by the use of Te Reo Māori on the radio. And I'll just take a couple of excerpts from this. So Kim Hill starts, of course, good, let us speak of Te Reo, you know, why don't you like it on the radio? And then Don Brash says, well, the reality is that the vast majority of New Zealanders speak primarily English. The number of people who speak primarily Māori is probably 0, and we're forced to listen to these sentences without any trace of translation provided. Shock horror. Why should I listen to Māori? I don't speak Māori. I went to school at a time when Māori was not taught. Now, interestingly, in terms of the intersection with my own background, although Don Brash is considerably older than me, he did grow up in Christchurch in Ōtautahi, where I grew up. And so, again, it's perhaps not surprising in that context that Te Reo Māori was largely invisibilised. It was certainly invisibilised even in my generation subsequently. So his argument is, I wasn't aware of it, therefore I don't need to engage with it. Then, of course, the other usual trope, which is brought in here, that English is the only international language, and therefore that's the reason we should focus in their thoughts at least solely on that. And then a brief discussion towards the end of the interview around schooling and the curriculum and the use of the use of te reo in education. And Kim Hill again says, te reo is offered in most schools now. Is that a good thing? And Don Brash responds, why would you learn something which for most people in New Zealand would never be more than a cultural value? Why not learn a language which will actually be useful to you? So this notion of value versus use, which I'll come back to in my conclusion. And Kim Hill ends rather exasperatedly by saying, we live in Aotearoa, we colonised it, we stopped the inhabitants from speaking their languages, and now we are learning to appreciate it. What's wrong with that? So that's Don Brash. Third example, you'll note a certain trend here with these commentators, all older white Pākehā men, all monolingual. This is Joe Bennett, another commentator. Again, writing in the Otago Daily Times, more recently, just a couple of years ago. And very popular syndicated opinion writer in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And he talks about his neighbour who lives in who's 70s, reads so many books a week, is a lifelong socialist, but she can't be bothered with Radio New Zealand. So again, the radio issue and the use of te reo Māori, all that Māori nonsense. It's interesting that, you know, being a lifelong socialist somehow precludes you from being a racist, which is, of course, clearly not the case. But I'll leave that point for the moment. And in his scenario, he drives past Miss Plum. She's picking plums. That's her his pseudonym for her. And because of this discussion, he turned on the radio and then makes these observations about the commentator, the news host, dropping in and out of the Māori language in a way I've never heard anyone do in actual life, which is interesting because, of course, bilinguals and multilinguals code switch and translanguage all the time. So a very monolingual conception here in terms of this observation. And then he goes on, as an English speaker, I had to sieve what I heard, distinguishing what I understood from what I didn't, and it didn't make for relaxed listening. And so he says, I understood the misgivings of Miss Plum. And then, of course, mansplaining, as they do. Do I need to explain how language works? Well, for him, language exists for one reason only, to communicate meaning. The Radio New Zealand national announcer appears to be speaking a new and hybrid tongue for a moral and political purpose. In doing so, shock horror, she was alienating Ms. Plum, educating no one, patronising Māoridom, I'm not sure why or how, and barking up a barren linguistic plum tree. So those are some recent examples of this overt backlash towards the normalisation of te reo Māori, and I'll pick up some of the tropes that they use, as I said, in my concluding comments. But just briefly, let me just give you some broader examples before I draw this to a close. Don Brash's organisation, as I said, Hobson's Pledge, was also very committed to trying to get te reo off any form of public media. And so for many years, for about a decade, up until only a few years back, it waged a coordinated campaign complaining to the Broadcasting Association Standards Authority whenever the use of te reo Māori was heard or seen on radio and television. And it was only eventually, a couple of years ago, that the BSA realised that te reo Māori is an official language, so why would we be countenancing these complaints? But nonetheless, it was a long and sustained campaign. This is Hobson's Pledge, which has a significant and overt anti-Māori agenda. And if you have the fortitude for it, you can look at this website directly. Still very active, still very politically engaged, a small lobby group, but very politically effective, very vocal. And then, as some of you may know, more recently, just in the last few months, we have had a change of government to a Conservative coalition at the end of last year, where two of the minor parties have overtly racist and anti-Māori agenda, and have focused in particular on te reo Māori. So they've taken away, for example, any bonuses for civil servants who are bilingual in te reo Māori, even though that's a common practice, of course, around the world. They have stopped a lot of te reo Māori initiatives, one of which was this one, to make bilingual signage. Interestingly, although we've had, as I said, 40 years of language revitalisation, we've been very slow in terms of establishing bilingual signage. But under this current government, this will not be pursued. And concomitantly, we've had an overt rise in anti-Māori and anti-te reo Māori in the public domain, particularly in this case, one example of basically whitewashing, literally, te reo Māori from signs, and often directed particularly at Māori women, so a conflagration of the sort of in-self-phenomenon of sexism and racism and bigotry. So that's the context in which Aotearoa New Zealand is currently. And there have been moves to resist this, including some of my own commentary around this, but nonetheless, linguistic racism here and elsewhere, given the increasing prominence and extremism, particularly associated with white supremacy and far-right groups, seems to be once again on the rise. So let me draw this to a close. Observations and conclusions, just 2 slides with just a brief segue in the middle. What we see here in the arguments against te reo Māori, and I would argue this more broadly, as I've said, I think these arguments have been used in the past for French in Quebec, and they've been used in the past for Basque and Catalan and Welsh, which I did my doctoral study on. So they're not just specifically to Aotearoa New Zealand or even to Indigenous languages, but any minoritized language in contexts of linguistic hierarchies of prestige and generally national contexts. But language is reduced or is viewed as a reductionist vehicle of communication. So what we see here is the fissure of identity from communication. And so on that basis, we see the inevitable invocation of the communicative superiority of English and other international languages. So what we see here in effect is the elision of language use with language reach. We saw that in the Weatherall and Potter excerpt directly, where they argued about trading languages, even though, ironically, those languages haven't continued to be widely spoken in Aotearoa New Zealand. But it's a common elision that language use is elided, conflated, reduced to notions of language reach. In my own arguments in response to that, I say, well, the most useful language alongside English in Aotearoa New Zealand is te reo Māori. It's a language you're most likely to hear in everyday conversation. It's still the second most spoken language in Aotearoa New Zealand, so it's a highly useful language. It's the language that's only spoken here. So why wouldn't you want to learn it, particularly given that bilingualism and multilingualism is an advantage in any language? What we see here also is a very monolingual conception, constructing linguistic diversity and bilingualism often as an obstacle to communication. So this comes back to the monolingual bias that I addressed and many of my colleagues have addressed in relation to the multilingual turn. And we also see here te reo Māori constructed as communicatively limited and thus useful for identity purposes only, if that. So again, the Weatherall and Potter argument, but also Don Brash's argument that this is a language that's not of much wider use, again based on the related precept of language use equaling language reach. Although, interestingly, and this again is a common trait across a wide range of contexts, dominant language speakers, English speakers in this context, simultaneously fail to acknowledge the importance of their own language use to their identity. So the fact that these monolingual English speakers are so outraged by the rise of te reo Māori is in itself an indication of their investment in English monolingualism. So although it's never specifically stated, of course, it's identity, English language monolingualism, for them at least, is a very important feature of their identity as well as their privilege. And this relates more broadly to the work of the political theorist Helder de Schutter, the Belgian political theorist, who looks at this notion of instrumental language ideology. So this comes back also to the early work in language planning, where we see a linguistic ontology where language is externalized and seen as a tool of communication. The normative conclusions from that is that languages are only there for communication and democratic deliberation. We see a lot of this work in political theory, where the work Brian Barry, for example, and other political theorists say that language is important only for maintaining democracy and for communicative purposes. Therefore, bilingualism and multilingualism is an obstacle to democracy. Related notions of efficiency, equality of opportunity, the myth of social mobility, which I've argued elsewhere, that English particularly, and we see this with the rise of EMI worldwide, of course, the idea of social and educational mobility intrinsically being linked to English is a strong motif. And in terms of nation-state congruence, the notion of social cohesion and solidarity. The outcome, of course, is the replication of the nation-state model, linguistic homogeneity. And yet, in the New Zealand context, what we are seeing currently is a rapid rise in the number of adult learners particularly, but not exclusively so, who wish to learn Te Reo Māori. So Te Reo Māori courses around the country, despite this overt backlash, are bursting at the seams. And we also know from the latest census, for example, that there are the rise of the Māori population who have Māori ancestry is now 20%. So 1 million New Zealanders have some Māori ancestry. And we're also increasingly ethnically diverse. So we have 160 languages spoken in Auckland, Tamaki Makaurau, for example. So we're an exemplar also of linguistic superdiversity. But interestingly, those who are newer New Zealanders, migrant New Zealanders, are also interested in learning Te Reo Māori, perhaps because they are themselves already bilingual and multilingual. And so this is just my final slide, and I'll draw this to a close. So what we see here are a number of key contradictions that arguing against this expansion of Te Reo Māori in the public language and public language domains actually tacitly acknowledges, contradictorily, its communicative efficacy. So basically, the whole notion that the language is not communicatively effective is undermined in those who argue against it. Normalization, though, has been constructed by monolingual English speakers as an illiberal imposition on them and as anti-democratic. So this is, again, the discourse, the trope that we talked about earlier, and which we've seen worldwide, including in response to the early days of Bill 101 in the Quebec context. And what happens here is that this is often predicated on the notion of the individual right to abstain from becoming bilingual, or the individual right to remain resolutely monolingual, because those colonial legacies are then, they continue to be instantiated in those who speak the dominant language. In my context, and I'd be interested to hear if this is similar elsewhere, the key protagonists are not solely so, but they are a very visible part of this anti-Te Reo movement. They're predominantly older, predominantly monolingual English speakers who grew up, as I said earlier, in an era where Te Reo Māori was still invisibilized by colonisation, and so had very little interaction with Te Reo Māori on a daily basis. When they did, it was in the sort of bastardized versions of Te Reo Māori that were incorporated or subsumed into New Zealand English. So mispronunciations, a lot of the mispronunciations of for example, place names and other common Māori words have been replicated and sedimented in New Zealand English. And as I said, their primary aim is to preserve and entrench the colonial privilege, coming back to Raciolinguistics, of their English monolingualism. And yet, despite this somewhat depressing context, more, as I've said, younger Māori and migrant New Zealanders are wanting to learn Te Reo Māori, suggesting a clear generational and multi-ethnic difference over time and the possibilities of change. So thank you once again for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I welcome further discussion with you. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. May. It was really inspiring to hear, what all that you had to say. It was fantastic.